Hidden behind the opulent tapestries of the werewolf king's fortress, a terrible secret festered. A royal heir whimpered in the shadows, his agony ignored by everyone, until a lowly servant brushed through his tangled fur and uncovered a nightmare so grotesque it would rip the entire kingdom apart. High in the isolated freezing peaks of the northern valleys stood Ashford Castle, a formidable stone fortress, ruled by Alpha King Alejandro Redfern. To the outside world, Alejandro was a ruthless and brilliant tactician, a medieval warlord who had united the scattered werewolf packs under one banner through sheer force of will and military might. Yet behind the heavily guarded iron doors of his personal keep, the great Alpha King was a man slowly drowning in despair. His grief stemmed from the deepest chambers of the castle, where his only son, 6-year-old Leith Redfern, was kept hidden from the kingdom. Leith was dying. It was not a swift, merciful death upon a battlefield, but a slow, agonizing decay. 2 years prior, following the sudden and tragic death of his mother, the young pup had experienced his first premature shift. Instead of returning to his human form, his body had frozen in a grotesque midway state, half boy, half wolf. His bones were improperly fused, his spine unnaturally curved, and his fur was a matted weeping mess of sores and decay. The castle's physicians, imported from every corner of the civilized world, had all delivered the same grim diagnosis: a rare, incurable genetic rot inherited from his mother's bloodline. They claimed the wolf within him was rejecting its human vessel. Unable to bear the sight of his son's daily torture, Alejandro buried himself in the affairs of the kingdom, expanding his borders and crushing rebellions. He delegated the boy's care to his new betrothed, Lady Rosalind Beck. Rosalind was the daughter of a wealthy southern baron, a woman of impeccable poise and staggering beauty. She moved through the dreary halls of Ashford Castle like a radiant beacon, her silk gowns a stark contrast to the rough-hewn stone. To the court, she was a saint. She spoke tearfully of the poor, cursed prince, and personally oversaw his medical treatments, ensuring that only her most trusted personal healers were allowed inside his quarantined chambers. She ordered the room kept in perpetual darkness, claiming the light caused the boy's sensitive eyes too much pain. She restricted his diet, claiming heavy meats agitated his rotting stomach. Under her watchful eye, Leith was effectively buried alive. Enter Cindy Stone. Cindy was not a warrior, nor was she a noblewoman wrapped in velvet. She was a 22-year-old commoner from the sprawling lower village of Oak Haven, a pragmatic and sturdy woman who had spent her life scrubbing floors and tending to farm animals to keep her 4 younger siblings fed. When a brutal winter destroyed the village crops, Cindy became desperate. Word reached Oak Haven that Castle Ashford was paying exorbitant wages for a new servant to tend to the beast prince's chambers. The previous maids had all fled, whispering terrified rumors of a monster that snapped, bit, and wailed with the voices of demons. Driven by the threat of her family starving, Cindy made the treacherous trek up the mountain and accepted the position. Her introduction to her new duties was swift and devoid of warmth. Lady Rosalind's head physician, a gaunt man named Dr. Aris, handed Cindy a bucket of tepid water, a pile of rough rags, and a thick leather apron. "You are to clean the stone floors, empty the chamber pots, and wipe down the walls." Dr. Aris instructed, his voice entirely devoid of empathy. "Do not speak to the creature. Do not attempt to touch him. If he bites you, the infection will rot your arm off before nightfall. Do your work in the dark, as her ladyship commands, and leave the food tray at the door." "Understood." Cindy nodded silently, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took the heavy iron key, walked down the long, draughty corridor of the eastern wing, and unlocked the heavy oak door to the prince's chambers. The stench hit her first, a foul, metallic odor of rotting meat, stale urine, and sour fear. The room was massive, but entirely devoid of comfort. The heavy velvet curtains were nailed shut over the windows. In the furthest darkest corner, a small huddled mass of shadow trembled violently. As Cindy set her bucket down, a low, guttural snarl echoed through the room. Two glowing, feverish amber eyes pierced the darkness. "I mean you no harm," Cindy whispered, her voice remarkably steady, despite the terror gripping her spine. She did not grab a weapon. She did not back away. Instead, she slowly lowered herself to her knees, making herself as small and non-threatening as possible. The creature Laith dragged himself slightly forward. The meager light from the hallway illuminated his wretched state. He was painfully emaciated, his ribs jutting sharply through his patchy, dirt-caked fur. His front limbs were twisted awkwardly, and his breathing was a wet, ragged wheeze. He looked less like a demonic beast, and more like a terrified, beaten dog left to die in a ditch. Cindy felt a profound, heavy ache in her chest. The rumors in the village had spoken of a bloodthirsty monster. The physicians had spoken of a genetic curse. But looking at the small, broken boy shivering on the freezing stone floor, Cindy's practical mind immediately recognized something else. This was not the natural progression of a disease. This was profound, deliberate neglect. Over the next 2 weeks, Cindy quietly defied every order she had been given. It started with small, deliberate acts of rebellion. When Dr. Arris and the guards were not looking, Cindy would pry the heavy nails from one of the window curtains, allowing a single warm shaft of sunlight to pierce the suffocating darkness of the room. When the kitchens provided the standard meal for the prince, a bowl of watery grey gruel, laced with strong sedatives, Cindy secretly replaced it with scraps of roasted mutton and fresh marrow bones she smuggled in her apron pockets. At first, Laith was wildly aggressive. He snapped at her fingers, his sharp, misshapen teeth tearing the hem of her skirts. He trusted no one. But Cindy possessed a stubborn patience forged by years of raising unruly siblings. She would sit quietly on the floor near his corner, humming an old, rhythmic Oakhaven folk song, while she mended tapestries, simply allowing him to get used to her scent and presence. On the 14th day, the breakthrough happened. Cindy was humming, her eyes focused on her sewing, when she felt a cold, wet nose press tentatively against her elbow. She froze. Laith had dragged himself out of his corner and was sniffing her arm, his large amber eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of curiosity and desperate longing for affection. Slowly, deliberately, Cindy raised her hand and rested it gently on his head. For the first time in 2 years, the Alpha King's heir did not flinch away from a touch. He let out a long, shuddering sigh and rested his heavy, misshapen chin on her knee. "You're just a boy, aren't you?" Cindy murmured, gently stroking the cleaner patches of his fur. Just a brave little boy trapped in a terrible nightmare. With this newfound trust, Cindy decided it was time to do what the highly paid physicians refused to do. She was going to clean him properly. The next evening, while the castle was distracted by a grand banquet hosted by Lady Rosalind in the main hall, Cindy smuggled a large basin of hot water lavender soap and a set of iron grooming combs into the chamber. She lit several candles, illuminating the room fully. Laith whined nervously at the light, but Cindy shushed him gently, offering him a fresh piece of cured beef to chew on. "I know it hurts, little one," she whispered softly, "but we must get this filth off you. The dirt is making the sores worse." She started with his paws, working the hot, soapy water into the crusted mud and dried blood. Laith whimpered, but allowed her to continue, lulled by her gentle, rhythmic voice. As she worked her way up his back, Cindy's brow furrowed. The fur along his spine, just between his shoulder blades, was incredibly dense, matted into thick, hard dreadlocks. The skin beneath it was angry, swollen, and radiated an unnatural heat. "Hold still, Laith," she murmured, picking up the iron grooming comb. As she carefully parted the thickest clump of matted fur at the base of his neck, Cindy expected to find a massive cyst or a severe tick infestation. What she found instead made the blood freeze in her veins. Buried deep beneath the overgrown fur, completely invisible to casual observation, the flesh of the boy's back had been sliced open. The wound had partially healed over, but it was kept violently infected by a foreign object. Cindy leaned in closer, bringing a candle near the boy's skin, her hands beginning to tremble. It was a lattice of wire, stitched directly into the muscle and woven meticulously around the vertebrae of the boy's spine were dozens of ultrafine threads. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like strange surgical sutures, but Cindy's father had been a silversmith before he passed. She recognized the dull, distinct gleam of pure, unalloyed silver. In werewolf physiology, silver was violently toxic. It burned their skin, suppressed their healing abilities, and disrupted the connection between their human consciousness and their wolf spirit. But it was worse than just the wire. The silver threads acted as an anchor, holding a crushed, heavily perforated iron pouch deep inside the wound. Black necrotic fluid was weeping from the pouch, staining the surrounding flesh. Cindy recognized the sharp, bitter scent radiating from it instantly. It was concentrated wolfsbane. Bile rose in Cindy's throat. This was not a genetic rot. This was not an incurable disease passed down from a deceased queen. This was premeditated systematic torture. Someone had surgically implanted a silver and wolfsbane parasite directly into the boy's central nervous system. The device was designed to continuously poison him, ensuring his wounds never healed, his immune system remained destroyed, and his wolf form remained violently suppressed and trapped halfway through the shift. The horrifying realization crashed over her like freezing water. The treatments ordered by Lady Rosalind weren't failing to cure him. They were the very mechanism keeping him in agony. Dr. Aris's private bloodlettings and poultices were just a cover to maintain the deadly device and repack the wolfsbane. Lady Rosalind didn't just want the boy dead. She wanted him to waste away, slowly making it look like a tragic natural illness, ensuring she would bear the only healthy heir for the Alpha King. Oh, merciful heavens! Cindy breathed, tears pricking her eyes, as Laith looked back at her, whining in confusion at her sudden distress. "They've been poisoning you," Cindy's mind raced. She was a peasant, a lowly maid who had barely been in the castle a month. If she went to the guards, Rosalind would have her executed for treason before the sun rose. If she tried to remove the device herself, the silver wires wrapped around his spinal cord could paralyze or kill him instantly. She needed proof, and she needed to bypass the entire court to get it directly to Alpha King Alejandro Redfern. Her hands shaking, Cindy reached into her apron and pulled out a pair of heavy sewing shears. "I am so sorry, Laith. This is going to burn for just a second, but I promise you, I will make them pay." She carefully isolated one of the loose silver wires that had breached the surface of the infected skin. With a swift, hard clip, she snipped a 2-inch piece of the blood-stained silver and tucked it securely into the bodice of her dress. Suddenly, the heavy iron lock on the chamber door clicked loudly. Cindy gasped, dropping the shears. She scrambled backward, kicking the basin of bloody water out of sight beneath the heavy wooden bed frame, just as the oak door swung open. Lady Rosalind Beck stood in the doorway, her elaborate emerald gown sweeping the stone floor. Behind her stood Dr. Aris, holding a fresh leather satchel of medicine. Rosalind's sharp, calculating eyes swept the room. She took in the lit candles, the missing curtain nails, and finally settled on Cindy, who was kneeling breathlessly beside the trembling prince. "Well, well," Rosalind said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness as she stepped into the chamber. "It seems our new maid has been busy." "I asked you a question, girl." Rosalind snapped her voice, dropping its usual sickly sweet facade to reveal the jagged, cruel edge beneath. She stepped further into the draughty room, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the wet stone floor and the shivering werewolf pup. "What are you doing to my stepson?" Cindy kept her head bowed, hiding the frantic pulse beating in her throat. She gripped her apron tightly, ensuring the clipped piece of silver wire was safely hidden against her skin. "Forgive me, my lady," Cindy said, forcing her voice to tremble with the exact kind of subservient fear a peasant ought to display. The prince was restless. The dirt in his fur was causing a terrible stench, and I thought bathing him might soothe his temper. I meant no disrespect. Dr. Orris pushed past Rosalind, his thin face drawn in a harsh scowl. He marched over to Leith, who immediately shrank back, a low, terrified whine escaping his throat. Iris grabbed the boy roughly by the scruff of his neck, uncaring of the whimpers of pain, and dragged him toward the candlelight. "She has been grooming him, my lady." Iris hissed his eyes, scanning the wet-parted fur along Leith's spine. Suddenly the physician's face went entirely pale. He saw the precise cut Cindy had made. The hidden lattice of wire was partially exposed. Panic flared in Iris's eyes, and he spun around, locking his gaze on Cindy. She saw it. Rosalind's perfectly sculpted face went completely blank. The heavy silence in the room stretched until it felt as though the stone walls were closing in. When she finally spoke, her voice was a terrifying deadpan whisper. "Kill her. Dispose of her body in the lower ravine. Tell the castle guard the beast tore her throat out." Iris dropped his medical satchel and lunged at Cindy, pulling a long, wicked surgical blade from his coat. But Cindy was forged in the grinding poverty of Oakhaven. She possessed a survivor's raw, unpolished instincts. As the physician grabbed her shoulder, Cindy dropped low, scooped up the iron grooming comb from the floor, and drove it with all her strength into Iris's thigh. The doctor shrieked, dropping his knife and clutching his leg. Taking advantage of the chaos, Cindy scrambled backward, grabbed the heavy bucket of filthy, soapy water, and hurled it directly at Rosalind. The murky water splashed across the noblewoman's face and ruined her emerald gown, sending her shrieking backward. Cindy did not look back. She bolted through the open oak door, slamming it shut behind her, and ran. She sprinted barefoot through the labyrinthine corridors of the eastern wing, her lungs burning. She could hear the shouts of Rosalind echoing behind her, calling for the private guards. Cindy knew she could not go to the regular sentries Rosalind had bribed or replaced half the castle's staff. There was only one man who could stop this, and he was currently in the highest tower of the keep. Bursting through the heavy doors of the inner courtyard, Cindy dodged startled servants and bewildered soldiers. She ignored the tearing pain in her feet as she climbed the winding stone steps of the king's tower. Two heavily armored royal guards stood before the thick mahogany doors of the war room. "Halt!" one of the guards bellowed, crossing his halberd with his partners to block her path. "The Alpha King is in a closed council with Commander Jonathan Hayes. No one enters there." "I must see the king," Cindy screamed, fighting against the heavy wooden shafts of their weapons. "It is about the prince. They are murdering his son." "Silence, madwoman," the second guard barked, grabbing Cindy by the arms and dragging her away. "Take her to the dungeons." "Alejandro Redfern," Cindy shrieked, fighting like a wildcat, kicking and thrashing against the armored men. "King Alejandro." "They are killing Leith." Suddenly, the massive mahogany doors violently blew open, the wood cracking against the stone walls. Alpha King Alejandro Redfern stood in the doorway. He was a terrifying sight, a towering mountain of a man with broad shoulders, dark, unkempt hair, and piercing gold eyes that seemed to glow in the dim torchlight. He wore a heavy leather tunic stained with ink, and maps his expression murderous at the interruption. Beside him stood Commander Jonathan Hayes, hand resting cautiously on the hilt of his broadsword. "Who dares scream my son's name in my halls?" Alejandro's voice was a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The guards immediately dropped to their knees, forcing Cindy down with them. "Forgive us, Your Majesty. This maid ran up from the lower levels, raving like a lunatic. We will remove her." "No!" Cindy gasped, ripping her arm free and scrambling toward the king's boots. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the bloody 2-inch strip of silver wire. Her hands shook violently as she held it up to him. "Your Majesty, please. Look at it. Smell it." Alejandro glared down at the shivering peasant girl, his jaw tight. But as he looked at the small, bloody object in her hand, the wolf within him suddenly slammed against the forefront of his mind. His golden eyes flared brightly. Werewolves possessed an extraordinarily acute sense of smell, and the Alpha King's was unmatched. Even from 3 feet away, the scent hit him like a physical blow. It was the sharp metallic tang of unalloyed silver, coated in the bitter earthy burn of concentrated wolfsbane. But beneath those toxic scents was something else, something that made the king's heart stop dead in his chest. It was the sweet, innocent scent of his own bloodline. It was Leith's blood. Alejandro snatched the wire from Cindy's hand, completely ignoring the way the silver hissed and burned against his own palm. He stared at it, his pupils dilating until his eyes were almost entirely black. "Where did you get this?" Alejandro demanded, his voice dropping an octave, shaking the very stones of the tower. "It was stitched into the prince's spine." Cindy sobbed, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "Hidden beneath his fur. There is a whole web of it, holding a pouch of wolfsbane deep inside his flesh. Lady Rosalind and Dr. Aris, they aren't treating him, Your Majesty. They are poisoning him to keep him trapped in the shift. They are killing him." The silence that followed was absolute. For a fraction of a second, Alejandro stood perfectly still. Then a roar tore from his throat, a sound of such profound, earth-shattering grief and wrath that it forced Commander Hayes and the guards to cover their ears. The sound was not human. It was the enraged howl of an alpha discovering his pup was being tortured. Bones cracked and popped as Alejandro's body began to forcefully shift out of pure, unadulterated rage. Thick claws tore through his leather boots, and his face contorted as he fought to maintain enough of his human form to navigate the castle. "Hayes!" Alejandro snarled, his voice distorted and monstrous. "Lock down the eastern wing. No one leaves." The heavy oak door of the prince's chamber did not just open. It was entirely blasted off its iron hinges, shattering into splinters against the stone floor. Rosalind and Dr. Aris had barely managed to stop Aris's bleeding, and were frantically trying to pack Leith into a heavy wooden crate to smuggle him out of the room. At the explosive entry, both froze, terror, draining the color from their faces. King Alejandro stalked into the room, followed closely by Cindy and a dozen heavily armed royal guards. The king did not say a word. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, grabbed Dr. Aris by the throat, and lifted the grown man entirely off the ground. Aris choked and thrashed his legs, kicking uselessly in the air as Alejandro's claws dug into his windpipe. "Alejandro, my love, wait!" Rosalind screamed, stepping backward, holding her hands up in a desperate plea. "This maid is a spy. She attacked us and mutilated the poor prince. I was only trying to—" Alejandro dropped Aris, allowing the physician to collapse onto the floor, gasping for breath. The king turned to his betrothed. There was no warmth in his golden eyes, no shred of the affection he had once held for her. There was only the cold, mechanical promise of death. "Commander Hayes," Alejandro said calmly, though his hands shook with barely contained violence. "Take Lady Rosalind to the deep dungeons. Chain her to the wall using pure silver shackles. If she speaks, cut out her tongue." "No, Alejandro, you cannot do this. I am a daughter of the South. My father will rage war," Rosalind shrieked as 2 guards seized her arms and dragged her ruthlessly toward the door. "Let him come," Alejandro replied, his voice deadly soft. "I will send him your head in a box." As Rosalind's screams faded down the corridor, Alejandro turned his attention back to the corner of the room. Leith was pressed tightly against the stone wall, whimpering in terror at the noise and the violence. The king's intimidating posture instantly vanished. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the filth on the floor, and slowly crawled toward his son. "Leith!" Alejandro whispered, his voice cracking with a profound, agonizing sorrow. "My boy, my brave, beautiful boy. I am so sorry." Leith bared his teeth, terrified of the massive man. But Cindy stepped forward. She knelt beside the king, reaching out and gently placing her hand on the pup's trembling snout. "It's all right, little one," Cindy hummed softly, repeating the Oakhaven folk tune she had used for the past 2 weeks. "You're safe now. He is your father. He loves you." At Cindy's soothing touch and voice, Leith's growls subsided. He looked from Cindy to Alejandro, eventually leaning his heavy matted head forward to sniff the king's hand. Alejandro closed his eyes, tears tracking through the dust on his face as he felt his son's touch for the first time in 2 agonizing years. "We have to remove the silver, your majesty," Cindy whispered, gently breaking the tragic moment. "The physician is still alive. We must make him undo his work." Under the threat of being slowly dismembered, a sobbing, terrified Dr. Orris was forced to guide the royal healers through the intricate, horrifying process of dismantling the silver web he had built. Cindy stayed by Leith's head the entire time, holding him down, stroking his fur and whispering reassurances as the healers carefully snipped the toxic wires and extracted the rotting pouch of wolfsbane from his spine. The moment the final piece of silver was pulled from the boy's flesh, a profound change rippled through the room. Leith let out a loud, shuddering gasp. The unnatural heat radiating from his body vanished. His twisted, misshapen bones began to snap and pop, realigning themselves as the suppression of his wolf spirit finally lifted. The matted fur rapidly receded, melting into the skin as the boy's natural healing abilities, dormant for years, violently kicked into overdrive. Within minutes, the monstrous half-shifted creature was gone. In his place lay a fragile, sleeping 6-year-old human boy, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, his breathing finally deep and even. Alejandro scooped the naked sleeping boy into his arms, burying his face in his son's neck, weeping openly in front of his guards and servants. He held him as if letting go would cause the world to end. Hours later, after Leith had been moved to the king's own opulent sunlit chambers and tucked beneath warm furs, Alejandro found Cindy standing quietly in the hallway. She had scrubbed the blood from her hands, but still wore her tattered maid's dress. She bowed deeply as the king approached. "Stand up, Cindy," Alejandro commanded gently. Cindy straightened, surprised to find the towering warlord looking at her, not with the arrogance of a ruler, but with the profound reverence of a man who had just been handed back his soul. "You possessed nothing," Alejandro murmured, looking at her calloused hands and weary eyes. "You had no protection, no title and no weapon. Yet you walked into the dark and faced down a monster to save a child that wasn't your own." "He is just a boy, your majesty," Cindy replied softly. "He deserved someone to be brave for him." Alejandro reached out his massive, scarred hand, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch sent an unexpected electric jolt through Cindy's chest, a spark of warmth that made her breath catch. "You are no longer a maid in this castle, Cindy Stone," Alejandro stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "From this day forward, you are the royal ward to the crown prince. You will sit at my right hand, and your family in Oakhaven will never know the bitter chill of winter or the ache of hunger again. Alejandro took a step closer, his golden eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart race. The darkness that had clouded the king's soul for years had fractured, and the woman standing before him was the light pouring through the cracks. And perhaps, Alejandro added his voice, dropping to a low, intimate rumble, if you will permit me, I might show you that the Alpha King is not merely a warlord, but a man who knows how to treasure the savior of his family. Cindy looked up into the king's eyes, seeing the genuine affection and fierce loyalty blazing within them. She smiled a soft, radiant expression that chased away the lingering shadows of the fortress. I think I would like that very much, Alejandro. The castle of Ashford, once a tomb of secrets and despair, finally breathed again. The true monster had been banished to the dark, and in her place, a brave commoner and a fierce Alpha King would rebuild a kingdom based not on fear, but on a love that had survived the deepest shadows. If this thrilling tale of courage, betrayal, and unexpected romance kept you on the edge of your seat, we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Cindy's shoes when facing the wicked? Lady Rosalind, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking, heart-pounding werewolf dramas every single week.